Okay, so welcome to Humanistic Approaches. We're on chapter 6, and one of the humanistic approaches we'll be talking about is existential therapy. Next week, we'll be talking about person-centered. So, when we're talking about existential therapy, we have to break the word down to exist. So, existence. Or exist. That's what existential is dealing with. It's dealing with like humanity and the problems of living, the problems that humans constantly are dealing with. So you probably heard things over the years like existential crisis, existential dread, existential anxiety. So what exactly is existential therapy? How did we get here? So we have to go back to the 1940s and 50s, and this therapy gets developed in response to World War II. By the 1960s, it becomes a distinct approach. But what was happening in Europe, particularly, was they had just won the war against the Nazis, and Europe had been bombed and was in pretty rough shape. So a lot of the people who were there were just trying to understand how humans could treat humans this way, trying to understand how to rebuild their lives. And so they had a lot of questions that came back to the nature of humanity, the nature of existence, meaning and purpose, and things like that. So a lot of the therapists started going back and looking at the existential philosophers, and they started, I think, in the mid 1800s is when existential philosophy became a thing, and they started incorporating and merging existential philosophy with existential psychology and developing existential therapy. So what existential therapy is it's a therapeutic approach that explores themes like meaning, freedom, and authenticity. The purpose of the therapy and what makes it humanistic is it helps individuals find meaning in their lives, to live more authentically, and to confront existential anxieties. And one of the biggest existential anxiety is death. So oftentimes, the first time that I heard of existential therapy was actually as a therapy for helping people cope with grief and loss. Um, And so the core focus is understanding how existential concerns can affect a person's life. It is insight oriented. So even though it's humanistic, it is insight oriented, similar to psychoanalysis. So it helps people gain insights into their problems, enabling them to better understand the existential themes affecting their lives. So example, recognizing how fear of death is causing a person to be overly anxious about the well-being of others, or maybe even the well-being of themselves. Or another part of existential is recognizing how avoidance of responsibility is causing feelings of stagnation and helplessness. So where does existential therapy come from? Oh, we explored this in the last slide, but it's refers to the nature of existence or the experience of being, and it's that blend of philosophy and psychology. The existential philosophers from the 19th and 20th century. There are more existential philosophers, and you can read about them in your textbook. But the ones that I'm going to focus on are Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Jean-Paul Sartre. So Kierkegaard lived from 1813 to 1855. He is considered the father of existentialism, and he was focused on and explored individual choice, faith, and the subjective nature of truth. So when we're talking about subjective versus objective, so objective is if we think about time, right? How many uh, seconds are in a minute. So we have 60 seconds in a minute. That's an objective measure of time. Subjective measure is your experience of a minute. So I think we've all experienced where 60 seconds can go by in the blink of an eye, depending if we're doing something fun and exciting. And if we're bored, it can subjectively, that 60 seconds can just really feel like forever. So that's that subjective nature. Objective, it's measurable. Subjective is our experience of it. So he was interested in the subjective nature of truth. So if you think about television shows that you may have seen, there might be an episode where something happens and they go to talk to the witnesses, and all the witnesses see something completely different versus like what actually happened. They all have different pieces of the puzzle, and some of it might be true, some of it might not be true at all. But that's where that's kind of an idea in terms of this exploring the subjective nature of truth. You hear things like truth is in the eye of the beholder, all of those types of things. So he was interested in exploring that. He also explored anxiety and despair as fundamental human experiences. So, we like to think of human experiences. Hopefully, we can have other, happiness, joy, other experiences, awe, maybe. But also, anxiety is very prevalent in our society. And despair can be as well. He talked about one of his quotes in terms of understanding anxiety and its relationship to freedom. He talked about anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, meaning that we have the freedom to choose, but oftentimes we don't want to accept the responsibility of choice, and that can create anxiety in our lives. So anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And then another quote by him, the most common form of despair is not being who you are. So you can see in existential philosophers or even existential psychology, they're looking at that authenticity. Who really are you? And if you aren't who you really are, then you can be held back. You can feel depressed. You can feel despair. Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, he's most known for nihilism, but he also dabbled in existentialism as well. And nihilism is the belief that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. And the reason why he explored existentialism is because he said that if nihilism is the disease, then creating meaning is the cure. And he looked at existentialism as being able to find meaning and purpose. Um, so he believed that individuals have a responsibility to create meaning through strength, creativity, and authenticity. And one of his quotes that I thought was interesting about this is, "We have art in order to not die of the truth." So if you think about in our world, what art is for us, it can be music. The music can be like uplifting, can help distract us from the doldrums of everyday life. We have television shows, we have movies, we have video games, we have books, we have painting, sculpture. So he is like, we have this in our world. We have art in our world in order to not die from the truth of the reality of existence. And then we have the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. He believed freedom of choice leads to anxiety. And we saw that a little bit in Kierkegaard as well. He further expounds on this and says that choice, when we make choice, that equals commitment, and commitment equals responsibility. And so some people we may have met in our lives that have fear of commitment, we may have heard of that. He also believed in the concept of bad faith, and he called bad faith are the excuses that we make to avoid taking responsibility for change or for choice. And one of his quotes around this is, "Man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does." So that kind of sums up some of the harder aspects of existence and philosophy. And these were, you'll see that many of the psychologists go back and actually study the existential philosophers to help develop their ideas of existential psychology and existential therapy. So, some key concepts when we're talking about existential therapy that come up time and time again when you're working with people is they might have the existence of being. So, some of the existential questions to help people explore this existence of being, how do you make sense of challenges or suffering that you faced, or what do you feel is missing in your life right now? That also kind of connects to search for meaning as well. There's existence of being and search for meaning. There's also freedom and responsibilities. In what ways do you feel you have the freedom to make choices, and how do you experience the responsibilities that come with it? We have the search for meaning. What gives your life meaning and purpose? Isolation and connection is also something that human beings struggle with, and I think we've seen that. If you pay attention to some of the news reports that are out there, they talk about how loneliness is like the new epidemic, that so many people are experiencing loneliness in the world right now. So themes of isolation and connection are explored with existential. So, questions to explore that. In what ways do you feel isolated from others? What does meaningful connection with others look like to you? How do you navigate the tension between being a part of a community and maintaining your individuality? And so some of this might remind you a little bit of Adler in his social interest concept in terms of having people, when people are connected to the society, to people in their life, that they have better psychological health. And you also see that theme play out here in existential psychology. And then confrontation of death, death anxiety. So what thoughts or feelings come up for you when you consider your own mortality, and how does it influence the way that you live? So those are some of the deeper questions that come in terms of human existence. We can also map some of these existential concerns onto the Eric Erickson's developmental stages. So, if we look at identity versus role confusion between ages 12 and 18, how are people, teens in this age, searching for meaning or searching for identity? Who am I? What's my purpose? What 18-year-old or 16-year-old doesn't struggle with taking responsibility for the choices that they make, right? So those are all you might see some of those themes start showing up. And then when we move into the adult age, you get intimacy versus isolation between like 18 and 35. And so you see existential concerns about isolation and connection and identity coming up. Then 35 to 60, dealing with generativity and stagnation. This is where you can also see people start searching again for meaning and purpose, or if they're not able to find meaning and purpose, they might feel that life is meaningless as well. So we start asking those questions in our teen years: what is my purpose? And then we deal with them again. We revisit them again, between 35 and 60. And hopefully we've been able to um, move in the way of generativity, but we may not have. And then 60 plus, you may get integrity versus despair. So getting older, you're confronting death, whether it's your health or losing many of the family members around you. You could also be exploring themes of like isolation, especially from retirement. And it could change the connections that you have with people as well. So you can map a lot of the existential concerns onto Eric Erickson's stages of development. The key figures in existential psychology, Viktor Frankl is known for his work with meaning and suffering. Rollo May is focused on human experience, freedom, and complexities of existence. And then Irving Yalom, known for integrating existential themes into group therapy and grief therapy, doing a lot of work with grief. And then we've already explored how this comes out of World War II, this sort of interest in trying to understand humanity, the darker side of humanity, making sense and making meaning out of things that people experienced. So we have Viktor Frankl, and in this week's uh, thing in Blackboard, you'll see there's a video about Viktor Frankl's life. So you can pause and watch that if you want to, or watch it after this. But he had a very powerful, uh, meaningful life, and he went through a lot and contributed a lot to society. So he's a very interesting mini bio to watch. So Viktor Frankl, born in Vienna, Austria. When he was younger, he corresponded with Freud, wrote to Freud, and as he got older, he attended Adler's lecture. So he has that influence of Freudian influence as well as Adler's influence. He went to medical school and graduated at the age 25 in 1930. And he moved into psychiatry. So he practiced psychiatry in hospitals and medical clinics. He was interested in depression and suicide. And he started developing his ideas for logotherapy because he was treating people who were depressed and had suicidal ideation. And he found that when he asked the question, why, you know, why do you not take your own life, they would have reasons, and a lot of it had to do with like meaning and purpose. So he started to make the connection of how powerful meaning and perfect purpose is in people's lives and for making them want to stay here. So he developed a therapy around meaning and purpose called logotherapy. But as he started to develop this theory, it gets interrupted because of World War II, when Austria is taken over by the Nazis. He is eventually sent to a concentration camp. And if you watch the video, you'll see that he actually gets a visa to leave the country, but makes a decision about why he cannot leave the country. And so that's an interesting piece of the how you can see he is uh, that use of self concept that we talked about, that you can see how he makes meaning in the world, or how he makes sense of the world, ends up kind of becoming part of his existential psychology, his logotherapy. But when he was in the concentration camps, he noticed that the people that were in the concentration camps, the ones who had meaning in their lives were more likely to survive. And if you want to read more about that, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, where he does explore that in a lot of detail. The first part of the book is a memoir of his experiences. The second part of the book is him trying to develop more the ideas how to use logotherapy as a clinician. When he survived the concentration camps, he went back and got his PhD in philosophy, studying existential philosophy. In 63, he published Man's Search for Meaning. In 92, he created the Viktor Frankl Institute for Research and Education, and he passed away at age 92 in 1997. In his life, he published over 30 books, and he had essays and articles that he wrote as well. So, what is Frankel's logotherapy? So, logotherapy is our logo. The word logo is a Greek word, and it means healing through meaning. So, he sees that when people have meaning and purpose in their lives, that it can create healing in them. And so the basic principles are the will to meaning, meaning the primary motivation for humans is the search for meaning, not pleasure, like Freud, or striving, like Adler. He's saying that the primary motivation for humans is to find meaning. For freedom of choice, he says that individuals have freedom to choose their attitudes and respond to life circumstances. He says that's the last freedom that you have. And he talked about that when he was in the concentration camps, when dignity and everything was stripped from him and the people around him. He still felt like his last freedom was to choose his attitude. and how he handled things. And then creating meaning out of suffering. He talks about, you might see this in some of the Buddhist philosophy, that suffering is inevitable, suffering is part of life. And so he also takes the stance in life that suffering is unavoidable. But he also believed that you can find meaning in your suffering. He said it's not the suffering that matters, but how you choose to respond to it. So these were some of the basic principles of his therapy. I will say that while this therapy resonates with me, I have seen many clients where this does not resonate with. They will, and it can be very upsetting for them. They could say things like, "How dare you tell me to try to create meaning out of, senseless death or senseless things that have like happened into my life, senseless tragic events and things of that nature." Some people find it very reassuring and other people do not. And so I just want to say that while this is wonderful and very helpful for a lot of people, there are some people who do not find this type of therapy helpful. So it's really important to recognize that and respect that when you're working with clients. In terms of self transcendence and how to find meaning, he believes you can find meaning just like Nietzsche through creative action. So engaging in things that reflect your values, your passions, what hobbies that have meaning for you, artwork. So he says creativity is one way to do it. He also recognizes meaningful experiences. So, building relationships with family, with friends, with community, and he even acknowledges nature in terms of having meaningful experiences. And he also talks about an attitude change in terms of finding the meaning in suffering, choosing to respond to suffering or adversity in a way that can lead to growth and resilience. So think about yourself and whether or not this type of uh, approach resonates with you, or if you're not necessarily sure about it. But this is Viktor Frankl's therapy. So here's a case study in terms of like a person and how it might show up with them trying to find meaning and purpose. And how you can also use this as a mental framework to like understand what is happening with your client. So this therapist is working with a client named Thomas, who's 60 years old. Thomas entered counseling a year after retiring from a job he had held for more than 3 decades. And since leaving work, he described feelings of emptiness and directionlessness. He said his days were mostly spent watching TV or scrolling through his phone, and he often said, "I don't see the point of anything anymore." In the sessions, Thomas spoke about how his work had once made him feel useful and connected to others, and without that role, he struggled to understand what gave his life significance. The therapist, identifying that existential themes of meaning and purpose, encouraged Thomas to explore where he might still find meaning in his life. Thomas was able to reflect. He began recalling moments where he felt most fulfilled, such as mentoring younger coworkers, helping his grandchildren with school projects, and even volunteering. So gradually, Thomas began to see that while his career had ended, there were still opportunities for him to contribute to others, engage in meaningful activities, still existed. And over time, Thomas started volunteering at a local community center and reported feeling a renewed sense that his life still had purpose. So that's just one of the ways that it can show up. Another important contributor of developing existential psychology is Rollo May. Rollo May is born in the United States. When he originally graduated college, he got a bachelor's in literature. He went over to Greece and taught English for 3 years. And while he was over there, he took seminars with Adler in Vienna during his summers. When he came back to the US, he studied theology at seminary school and he met his mentor, Paul Tillich, was a German-American Christian existential philosopher. And then he left the ministry to pursue psychology. He worked on his PhD from 41 to 49, and during that time, he contracted tuberculosis. He had to go to a sanitarium, and while he was there, he studied existential philosophers, and he began to explore the existential dimensions of anxiety. So you have to recognize at that time, under sort of the psychoanalytic approach, anxiety was something that was to be eliminated. And Rollo May was like, I'm not sure if all anxiety, yes, there is a neurotic type of anxiety, but there is also a useful type of anxiety that can help to give you the motivation to work on things and to pursue things. So he ended up writing a book exploring the pros and cons of anxiety in 1950. He helped to popularize existential psychology in the US, and from 1953 until 1994, he was an instructor, a writer. He had a private practice. He was a clinical supervisor. He wrote 15 books and many articles and papers. He lectured extensively. And was really prolific in terms of spreading existentialism. So some of May's existential concerns, what he was interested in. So he was influenced he was trained in psychoanalytic and humanistic psychology and existential philosophy. So he had that mixture. He was concerned about the uniqueness of an individual, and he rejected labeling patients. He bristled at the industrialization and capitalism, and he felt that diagnosing. At the time, they were creating the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and he felt that labeling and diagnosing people was a product of industrialization and capitalism, and was not really seeing a person as a whole, just seeing a person as their problem. So he rejected labeling patients or diagnosing patients. Um, he was interested in authenticity and genuine human connection and was really concerned at the time in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of gimmick therapy, pop psychology, personal development seminars. There was a lot of cults at that time as well that were popping up. And he felt this sort of gimmick therapy that was symptom focused. He said, if you're only treating the symptoms, you're not dealing with the underlying issues of the human condition. So he was critical of that. He also was concerned with existence and authenticity and wanted to move away from doing, which he equated with producing and consuming, so that industrialization, capitalism, and move towards being. So that's kind of like Eastern philosophy. You'll see that in many of the Eastern philosophies or Eastern religions about just being present versus feeling like you always have to do. And he was really concerned with how technology and automation can alienate a person from themselves and others. And so this was only in the 60s and 70s, and not in this modern time where we have so many ways that we can be distracted because of technology, and it's making us so that we can numb ourselves and not be present with ourselves. It's creating disconnection and dissent, and so he was concerned with that at a time when technology was like in its infancy, and he was already worried about the things that we are seeing now. And he was also concerned with cultural disconnection. He was seeing people being preoccupied with superficial knowledge, like pop culture, and neglecting to explore one's inner thoughts, feelings, and experiences. He would say things like, most of what we know isn't particularly useful to understanding human existence. And he would ask this question, do you know more about pop culture, technology than you do about yourself or the nature of humanity? And I think oftentimes the answer is yes. In terms of his existential psychology and exploring anxiety has meaning. Going back to anxiety is normal and should not be eliminated. He said people have a lot of reasons that they to be anxious. You should be anxious about war. You should be anxious about climate change. You should be anxious about losing love and relationships. All of that is normal anxiety. He said normal anxiety does not lead to symptoms like headaches and stomach aches. And if you start having the somatization of your anxiety, well, then that will move into neurotic anxiety. But he also said that anxiety is the source of all creativity. If you do not have enough discomfort, then you are not driven to create. So I think you can argue for and against that. And then in terms of neurotic anxiety, he viewed that as when a person was experiencing neurotic anxiety, it was because they didn't have enough resources to cope with whatever the stressor was in their life. And that could be um, external resources, like not having enough money for like food and rent, but it could also be internal resources as well. He hypothesized that this could stem from parental rejection, or parents not modeling healthy ways to manage anxiety. And he said that anxiety is caused by a person being overwhelmed by a large goal. But if you can help a person recognize the gaps between their expectations and their goals, they could overcome anxiety. So if you think about how sometimes if you break the tasks down into smaller steps, it can be less overwhelming. So those are some of the things that he would try to teach and support his clients that he was working with. He also talked about the distortions of freedom and how individuals misunderstand, deny, or misinterpret their capacity for choice. So he says one of the ways that people misinterpret or deny their capacity for choice is personal agency. So they convince themselves that they have no choice or control over their circumstances. For an example of this is a person feeling trapped in their job without exploring opportunities to change employment. So he said that's how people deny their personal agency, their choice. There's also avoidance of responsibilities, avoid taking responsibility for choices, blaming others, maybe even like asking others to make a choice, a decision for them. And then if they don't like how it turns out, they can blame them. Um, and then there's conformity and inauthenticity. And he saw that as a distortion of freedom, where a person would conform to whatever societal norms were or whatever their family or partner's expectations, and that denied them from being their authentic selves. So an example of that could, simply think of a college student pursuing a major that their parents approve of, to avoid conflict or gain approval, even though it makes them miserable. So if we look at how this freedom and responsibility might show up, here's a case study. We have Derek, 47-year-old client, working with a case manager. Derek feels stuck deciding whether to leave a long-term relationship that had become increasingly stressful. During their meetings, he repeatedly asks his case manager what he should do, hoping that the therapist would give him a clear answer. Each time the topic came up, Derek listed reasons both for staying and for leaving, but ended by asking the case manager to tell him which option was the right one. The case manager acknowledged how difficult the situation was, but explained that the decision is ultimately his. And over several sessions, Derek began exploring his own values, concerns, and hopes for the future. Gradually, he started to see that while guidance could help him think things through, the direction his life took would depend on the choice he made. So this is a fairly common thing that you'll find in therapy or case management, where they're just like, I don't know what to do, just tell me what to do. Um, and so that's something that we have to be aware of and have a framework to understand why we don't give the answer and have a framework of understanding freedom, responsibility, and choice in terms of how to work with it and how to help our clients work with it so that they don't feel abandoned when we're just like shrug our shoulders and go, like, I don't know. That's not, what we do. We have more than that. And so this mental framework, I think of all the existential frameworks, has probably been the most useful in terms of working with clients and understanding the freedom and responsibility and choice and helping the clients develop the skills to take that on. Another figure in existential psychology is Irving Yalom, also born in the US, and he's still with us today. He graduated from medical school in 1956, became an existential psychiatrist. In 69, he became faculty at Stanford and taught psychiatry. He published lots of books. If you were taking a groups class, his theory and practice of group psychotherapy was like the standard and I believe it's still out there as still being published as a core textbook for group therapy or group work. He also published in 1980 Existential Psychotherapy. He published in 2001 The Gift of Therapy, which is really wonderful for new therapists or even old therapists to read to just look at he shares decades and decades of his clinical work and the insights that he has in terms of working with people and exploring some of the techniques and things that you learn in grad school but may like fall to the side as you get out there and so it's a really wonderful book and the thing that's nice about him is his writing style is very easy, very engaging to read as well. And he presently continues to write lectures and contributes to psychotherapy. He's written at least 18 books and many articles and papers on different subjects. So some of the things that Yalom contributed to existential psychology is the four ultimate existential concerns. We have isolation, which he talks about. Uh, how people struggle with making authentic connections with other people while also recognizing that some parts of existence is solitary. There are parts of us that no one else will know. There might even be parts of ourselves that we don't know. And so he talks about this isolation, that there's like this interpersonal isolation, and that could come from difficulty connecting with others, feeling understood by others, and that can create isolation. Interpersonal difficulty connecting with the self, difficulty knowing the self, and existential isolation, the parts of a person that are so unique they cannot be known by anyone else. He also talked about the meaninglessness, emphasizing the human struggle to find meaning in life, and so that recognizing it's a struggle and that many of us struggle with meaning and purpose. Some of us are able to find meaning and purpose through religion. Some of us are able to find meaning and purpose through our jobs, but some of us aren't. And so he recognizes that humans often struggle with this and bring this often to therapy. He also talks about death anxiety, and one of his quotes on this is, "Our existence is forever shadowed by the knowledge that we will grow, blossom, and inevitably diminish and die." Um, and he says that this just overshadows everything. We usually try to ignore it, deny it. We do many things to avoid thinking about death or thinking about our own mortality. But he says that fear of death is a fundamental part of the human experience, and it shapes our behaviors, our relationships, our mental health. And by confronting this fear, a person can live a more authentic and meaningful life. One of the questions that he asks a lot of his clients that he works with is, "What is it about death that frightens you?" And so that's going to be different from person to person, but that's something that he will explore with his clients. And then, of course, he has his take on freedom and responsibility, and he says that humans are radically free and burdened with responsibility for their choices. He calls it a burden, um, and that this can cause anxiety or lead people to live inauthentic lives, but it also is the key to finding meaning. So he does see a positive aspect of it. And the techniques to address the conflict, says it encourages self-reflection on where one might avoid responsibility in their lives or feel powerless to make decisions. So those parts of our lives where we feel like we don't have power to make decisions, he thinks can be very beneficial to explore in counseling. Um, to help get resolution to the burden of freedom and responsibility. And he feels that it can be very empowering. So here's a case study about death anxiety. We have Robert, a 58-year-old man, seeking counseling after experiencing frequent anxiety about his health. Although medical tests repeatedly show no serious problems, he found himself constantly checking his body for symptoms and searching online for signs of illness. He reported trouble sleeping and said he often thought about how quickly life seemed to be passing by. During sessions, Robert initially framed his concern as strictly medical. However, as the conversation deepened, he began sharing that a close friend had died unexpectedly the previous year. Since then, he had become increasingly aware of his own mortality. Understanding existential concern of death anxiety, the counselor helped Robert explore how his this heightened awareness of mortality was affecting him. Rather than focusing only on reducing symptoms, the session explored what Robert wanted to do with the time at hand. As he reflected on relationships, unfinished goals, and how he spent his days, Robert began shifting his focus from avoiding thoughts about death to thinking more intentionally about how he wanted to live life. So I think this is interesting here. One of the things that can happen if you know about like grief and loss is like at a 58-year-old man who comes in who is experiencing this type of anxiety, when it comes from out of nowhere, oftentimes there is an event that happens in life. Now, Robert might not be consciously aware that the death of the close friend started this, that there's a correlation between that, right? So that can be that Freudian collective, like, I'm sorry, the Freudian, like, unconscious where he's not aware of it, but it's showing up. You can even the fact that him being so focused on medical, right? Like that could be a defense mechanism, one of the defense mechanisms that we were talking about. Rather than dealing with his anxiety about death, he's just focused on the medical piece of it as well. So there's a lot of things that you can see happening here in this particular case study. So that's why it's important to understand psychoanalytic concepts and theories because it can help you draw more meaning, deeper meaning out of the problems that your clients are dealing with. And here, seeing some of these principles of existential themes can also help you to understand what's going on with your clients. So wrapping up, so some key takeaways in terms of approaches. It's rooted in existential philosophy developed by psychologists such as Viktor Frankl, Irving Yalom, and Rollo May. Focuses on human search for meaning, purpose, and authenticity. It recognizes common human concerns like awareness of mortality, so death anxiety, feelings of isolation, feeling alone and disconnected from others or even yourself, questions about meaning and purpose, and accepting responsibility for choices. And so the ultimate goal of this therapy is to help people live more meaningful, authentic, and engaged lives. So that is a little bit about existential therapy. And the next video we'll be watching will be humanistic Carl Rogers as well as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All right, take care.